The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 4, Language. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to use structurally sound sentences in a meaningful and functional manner. Learners should be able to use a range of figurative language such as idiom, idiomatic expressions, and proverbs with developing appropriateness.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. You will remember that we were examining figures of speech in our previous lesson that dealt specifically with comparisons. Do you remember what figures of speech are? Figures of speech are specific types or examples of figurative language. We looked at similes and metaphors and how they enhance our conversations and writing. Today we will look at some other interesting figures of speech that use comparisons. The first figure of speech we are looking at today is personification. Let's have a look at the definition of personification. Personification gives human qualities to inanimate or non-living objects or abstract ideas. It is important that you understand that personification does not apply to people or animals. Also, personification and metaphors are quite similar because they are both indirect comparisons. Now let's look at a couple of examples of personification. In each of these examples, we give human qualities to non-human things. Hunger, which is an abstract idea, cannot shiver or sit, but a person can. And leaves, an inanimate or non-human object, cannot dance, but humans or people can. By using personification, we allow the reader to strongly identify with the idea being expressed. This happens because, as people, we can easily understand comparisons with human qualities. Remember, like with all figurative language, personification creates a mental picture that goes beyond the literal meaning of the words. Another important thing I should point out to you is how to refer to personification when answering an exam or assignment question. You should never refer to a personification, but always just personification or an example of personification. I would now like to move on to two more examples of comparative figures of speech that are a little more complex. Can you remember how we defined a metaphor? A metaphor is an implied comparison between two people or objects. The words like and as are not used in a metaphor. One of the more interesting ways in which we can use metaphors is by creating extended or sustained metaphors. An extended or sustained metaphor is a metaphor that extends over more than just one line of a passage or a poem. In other words, the comparison continues. Look at this example of an extended metaphor. Remember, just like a normal metaphor, it is an indirect comparison. However, this is a longer comparison. Their relationship had always been stormy. After brief spells of sunshine, they were always cast into shadows of doubt and torrents of abuse. She longed to be in a calmer place. Here, the comparison between a couple's relationship and the weather, stormy, sunshine, and torrents, is sustained for a couple of lines. When a writer sustains a metaphor throughout a novel or a film, it is called an analogy. A novel like Animal Farm by George Orwell would be an example of an analogy. In this novel, the animals on the farm are compared to the politicians that grab power and become corrupt, and this comparison is sustained throughout the novel. Now let's look at another example of an extended metaphor. The excerpt from the song Tula Mtwanami by the South African band Jaluka contains an extended metaphor. The writer is using a metaphor as he is comparing his brothers and his sisters with seeds. By saying that they have been scattered in the wind, we become aware that they have travelled far. The writer continues his comparison with the word horizons, which we know refers to the farthest point which the eye can see. This is an extended or sustained metaphor as it continues over 2 lines of the lyrics of the song. If we look at the figurative meaning of the words, we can see that the writer is sad because his relatives have no security and have never found a place where they belong. Let's look at the excerpt again. The writer is comparing horizons with clothing. He is suggesting that human beings could fit into their surroundings. Often, a writer will use more than one figure of speech to create wider impact. But just be careful that you do not use mixed metaphors. A mixed metaphor is when incongruous or incompatible terms are used to describe something. It is usually confusing and can sometimes be very funny. If you have written something and it sounds a bit muddled to you, just check and make sure that you haven't used a mixed metaphor. Now I would like us to look at a rather unusual figure of speech that uses comparison. This is the apostrophe. Be careful that you do not confuse the figure of speech apostrophe with a punctuation mark apostrophe. An apostrophe is when an inanimate object, or a person who is no longer alive, or an abstract idea is spoken to as if it were a human being. It is addressed directly. Let's look at an example of an apostrophe. In the poem Death Be Not Proud by John Donne, the poet scolds death and suggests that death has no long-lasting power. As you can see in the extract, the poet is addressing death directly. In this case, we recognize that apostrophe was used because an abstract idea, death, has been addressed directly. In other words, the poet is talking to death. Let's try and confirm all you have learned about figures of speech that involve comparison. You should be able to identify similes, direct comparisons using like or as, metaphors, indirect comparisons stating that one object or person is something else, and personification, indirect comparisons giving inanimate things human qualities. Today we also looked at extended metaphors and apostrophe. Remember to always try and use your own original ideas when writing, and be careful not to use mixed metaphors. Effective and original examples of similes, metaphors, and personification will add to the effectiveness and impact of your writing. Figures of speech require some emotional involvement on the part of the reader and should elicit some reaction. If it is effective, it will create a mind picture of the idea. In our next lesson, we will learn about figures of speech that make use of sound devices. Goodbye.